welcome everybody again to an episode of the ideaXme show, the show that profiles humans behind the really big ideas that shape our world, inspire future creation, and for all those that like really good stories. I'm Ira Pastor, your health, aging, and longevity ambassador along for this ride. And so for the last several shows, we've been spending a lot of time at the different hierarchical levels of the disease and aging process, from the genome to tissue level physiological networks to the microbiome, even into the organism's external microenvironment. However, as exciting as all of these scientific discoveries we've been profiling are, at the end of the day, to have a beneficial impact on human health and disease and all the unmet medical needs we still have facing us in 2019, it really boils down to one thing: proper translation of these discoveries into registrational and commercializable interventions that clinicians can prescribe and patients can make part of their disease management protocols. So today's guest who is joining us, I'm extremely excited about. Clearly the expert's expert in doing translatable drug development the right way, is Dr. John LaMattina. With a PhD in organic chemistry, John climbed the ladder of big pharma to ultimately become president of Pfizer's global R&D organization, where he managed a group of 13,000 scientists and professionals from across the United States, Europe, and Asia. And for any of us that were in competing drug companies at the time, sort of watching the blockbusters come off the line, this is what we were dealing with: Lipitor, Viagra, Zoloft, Zithromax, Celebrex, Diflucan. The hits kept coming fast and furious, and really turned Pfizer into what became a $50 billion plus mega pharma organization is today. After Pfizer, John moved into venture capital as a senior partner at the PureTech Venture Group, where he sits on the board of many different startups and development phase companies in biotech. He's the author of several books, including Drug Truths, Dispelling the Myths of R&D, and the recently published Devalued and Distrusted: Can the Pharmaceutical Industry Restore Its Broken Image? He's also a routine contributor to Fortune magazine. That being said, John, thanks so much for coming on the show today and joining us.
Oh, Ira, thanks for having me, and thank you for that wonderful introduction.
My pleasure. Definitely my pleasure. So for those outside of the pharma industry that are unfamiliar with you, I'd like to give you the floor just for a little bit and, introduce yourself, sort of your background, where you grew up, how you ultimately got interested in science and the pharma industry, and ultimately how you made it to the top of what was arguably sort of the baddest R&D machine on the block in the last couple of decades.
Well, I'm born and bred in Brooklyn, New York, a long time ago. I always had an interest in science. I was one of those kids who had a chemistry set and didn't know what I was doing really when I was 9 or 10 years old, but had fun with that. Eventually, I knew I'd like to pursue chemistry, but I also wanted to pursue chemistry in such a way that whatever I did could possibly be used for a purpose. It sounds egotistical, but perhaps to benefit mankind. So as I went through college and then graduate school and even postdoctoral work, it was pretty clear to me that doing organic chemistry, the actual making of the molecules and trying to design them to have biological activity, was what I really wanted to do. It was very, very exciting kind of work. Frustrating work, because as you've probably told your listeners in the past, you can have a great idea and come up with an interesting hypothesis and develop a molecule that might actually test that hypothesis in humans, and if you're lucky, get to people and get approved by the FDA. And for every one compound you put into the development, for every 10 you put into development, only one comes out the other end. So it's, and furthermore, it's a very time-consuming process, anywhere from 10 to 15 years. So if you're somebody who likes instant gratification, it's not necessarily the field to go into. But the great part about it was I got to work with brilliant scientists from all different disciplines. In any drug discovery program, which is where I started, you have chemists, biologists, molecular biologists, drug metabolism people, process chemists, formulation scientists, toxicologists, et cetera, all of whom trying to get to the end goal, drug that can benefit thousands, if not millions of people across the world. So when it works, it's very exciting.
Looking back on the industry now, so, I've been around the industry for a while myself, and I think you probably agree with me that even if we go back, say, 20 years, it's a very different place than it is, was a very different place than it is today. Big pharma has transformed itself into mega pharma. You have many biotech companies of yesterday, the Gileads and the Celgenes, which now, you open the Forbes magazine and, they're in the top 20 pharma companies in the world. You hear a lot about personalized medicine and orphan diseases and more targeted approaches, but at the same time, I'll read things about, people on Wall Street saying, well, how are they going to keep up their growth without blockbusters? At the same time, I have people on the other end of the sort of the pipe, complaining about the so-called valley of death, how it's gotten so broad, and venture investors are investing later on because big pharma only wants finished stuff, and it's very hard to get a lot of the seed and early stage funding. Can you just give us your top line on sort of where you see things in 2019, both from sort of the big pharma perspective and the venture perspective, and sort of where a lot of this you might think is going in the next, say, decade or so?
So a couple of things. Number one, first of all, it's interesting. You read off some wonderful molecules that Pfizer put in the market in the 90s. Interestingly enough, they're all small molecules. If you would ask me what the big changes are now, with the most recent FDA approvals for the class of 2018, roughly half of those molecules are biologics, not small molecules, antibodies, gene therapies, and even other different things. So if you ask me one thing, first of all, that's been a major change, the type of medications being brought. With that has really made a landmark change in how companies are crafting their portfolios. So when I was at Pfizer, our portfolio in terms of research was largely in the areas of heart drugs, diabetes drugs, neuroscience drugs, an oncology group, and an arthritis group were the leading players. If you look at Pfizer's portfolio now, it's oncology, rare diseases, vaccines, and in immunology. Complete turnaround in 20 years. And what's driving that turnaround is a very interesting observation that you can make major breakthroughs for drugs, but drugs are medicines that really are meant for smaller populations, orphan diseases, as it would be. But you have to really qualify orphan diseases. Cancer is not really one disease. It's made up of a dozen or so orphan diseases. And what's also happened is that companies have realized that you can get good pricing if you come up with a really good medication, even though it might serve only 10,000. And so you touched a little bit about the future being dependent on blockbusters. I think the industry is going to do very well with a portfolio that, you're always going to, sure, nobody's going to turn down an Alzheimer's drug, which would be a blockbuster category, although the science there has been incredibly difficult. But clearly, people can generate a very distinguished portfolio and successful portfolio with drugs that may only treat 100,000 patients, but that are priced well. They won't be the Lipitor peaking at close to $13 billion a year, but they'll be $2 or $3 billion medication. That, however, has also resulted in the rise of a whole other set of approvals. You have to get approvals from the FDA, but now you also have to show the benefit of your medicines to payers, insurance companies, because just because you have a new drug that can treat a condition where there's already a drug or drugs in the marketplace doesn't mean to say that a payer will willingly reimburse it. Patients in their health plans will have easy access to it. Great example that's going on right now is in the atherosclerosis area, where statins are, and you mentioned one of them, Lipitor, and other statins have done very, very well. They're now generic and they're dirt cheap. There are companies now trying to come up with other agents that will lower LDL cholesterol, the so-called bad cholesterol, that perhaps could be additive to Lipitor or be used in people whom statins aren't well tolerated. But the hurdles that these companies have to go are tremendous, not just with the FDA, but for payers, because a high dose of a statin is still pretty cheap. And you can name a percentage, 70, 80, 90% of patients are well served with that. Just because something is new and may lower LDL cholesterol differently doesn't mean to say that a payer will readily agree to part of the formula. You have to prove to them that it has a benefit in addition to what statins will. And those kind of studies are expensive. They're called outcome studies, where you compare your new therapy to existing therapy. And basically you take people who have already had a heart attack or a stroke and you randomize them to get either your drug versus standard therapy and placebo versus standard therapy. And these studies will take 5 years and cost about $1 billion. And you have to show that your new therapy is performing better in reducing heart attacks and strokes than existing therapy. That's a whole new ballgame. That's a bit of a winding answer to your.
No, it was great, and I want to sort of continue along that path, because as you brought up sort of the pharmacoeconomics of the system now, and then also sort of the requirements from a regulatory perspective in terms of proving some of these different types of outcomes than we dealt with in the past. I want to sort of move into an article that you wrote about a month or so ago in Forbes, which was entitled "The Challenges in Bringing an Anti-Aging Pill to Market," where you basically highlight the fact that it's an area that, while potentially very lucrative, big pharma has shied away from it. It could take a very long time. Payoff is years away, and you highlighted some potential with sort of the metformin study that may or may not be happening. The article drove people in the longevity biotech space crazy. Some of them went nuts, and I was standing there like I'm on the fringes of that industry in a sense. I was like, wait a second. Calm down. Number one, John knows what he talks about. And number two, as good as the science and technology in this space may be getting, it still has to be translatable. Could you just give some of your top line thoughts on sort of the aging biotech space as it exists today, and sort of your feelings as far as developing therapeutics for diseases of aging versus the core processes of aging?
First of all, I just had my 69th birthday. If somebody comes up with a fountain of youth drug, man, I'll be the first to take it. So I have a personal stake in the success of this area. And I'll also say that there are excellent scientists doing great work at looking at different mechanisms that can extend the life of cells, and hopefully translate that into the life of animals and then humans. But the science is very early. And so, yes, you can extend the life of mice. You mentioned metformin with mice by about 6%. That's great, but as others have pointed out, mice are not humans, and translating this work to humans is going to be difficult. First of all, so you can do great studies in animals, but eventually you have to do a proof of concept study in humans.
Right.
So you have to think about this a little bit. So how do you do that? If you had a real anti-aging drug, you would put it into people, but what type of person would you pick? You can't pick somebody who's 30 or 40 years old, because how do you get to know it's extended their life? They're way too young. So you have to pick an elderly population. I'll say, let's use somebody like myself, about 70 years old. Then you have to give the drug, and you have to run a study in comparison with placebo. And you have to have people who are relatively healthy, because the elderly can also be sick, and you don't want to have people who have cancer or come down with cancer or are prone to heart disease in your study. So you have to try and take somewhat of a fit population, and you have to test them for a period of time. And what you're measuring in such a study is living longer, quite simply, and not getting heart attacks or strokes or cancer or Alzheimer's or whatever, in a patient population that, quite frankly, is going to get that anyway. That's part of aging. Right. You have to run a study in 70-year-olds perhaps, and run the study for a long time, and hope that you can see a difference. And statistically speaking, you'd probably have to run 10,000 patients in such a study over a period of time, which costs a lot of money to do. So it's interesting. You mentioned metformin. Metformin is an interesting diabetes drug. It's been on the market for 70 years, and these researchers found that in worms, they can extend life 70% if you put them on metformin. And that's the aforementioned mice extend their life 6%. Nobody knows how metformin works, but certainly safe, and so you can safely test it in people. But the authors and the researchers here are having trouble raising the funds to do the study. They think they could do the study with only 3,000 patients, which I think is a reach. You'd have to see a pretty profound effect of a drug with that many patients in order to be confirmed that it was working. But they can't seem to raise the funds from places like the NIH. I think they've had a study designed for a while. I think they call it TAME, T-A-M-E, but nobody's funding it just yet. And I think that's the reason people are worried that how much this is going to be very difficult to do and difficult to prove. And so there's been a real hesitancy on people doing this. And I don't know of any big pharma companies involved. They take enough long shots in their portfolios for things like Alzheimer's disease and other areas where something like this seems to be a bit of a higher risk. So it's not that I don't applaud the research. I don't respect the research. I don't think these are great scientists. You used a great word before, translation. showing in people that these animal studies and translating it to a clinical study where it works is very, very difficult to do. Now, it's not impossible. What some people are doing are trying to see, for example, during flu season, if you have a drug that you think is helping the aging process by helping the immune system, then maybe if you had a flu season and you took an elderly population, which is susceptible to a flu, that maybe you can reduce the incidence of such attacks during the winter. And there are some companies approaching it that way. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily a longevity drug, although it will certainly save lives. And I think that's very, very important. But the whole found the youth concept, I think, right now it's got a long way to go. Moving on
along those lines, going from sort of the registrational dynamic to more of the sort of the legislative front now. There's been a lot of activity in recent years, both here in the U.S. and abroad, on different ways to sort of go about speeding up the development process, or at least the delivery of development stage candidates to so-called no-option patients. Obviously, here in the U.S., we passed the right to try legislation, though there's obviously a lot of debate whether that versus traditional expanded access is viable or not. In Japan, you have this conditional approval process for certain regenerative medicines, phase 2. And then, we're reading about some really strange things. About a year and a half ago, Merck announced this deal with the government of China. Basically, they set up this location, this Hainan Island, which is somewhere south of Hong Kong, east of Vietnam, where basically you as a cancer patient could go, if you have a cancer that Keytruda is not approved for, you can go on a nice vacation in warm weather, nice beaches and everything, and try it. So very interesting to see, one of the largest drug companies in the world sort of getting their feet into medical tourism, which is always sort of seen as somewhat of a niche. What do you think about some of these models? Do they have legs to them? Are they here to stay? What's your opinion on all of this stuff?
Well, again, it's a multi-layered question.
Take your time with it.
Let me start back at the earlier part of your question. Interestingly enough, Scott Gottlieb, who I thought was a terrific FDA commissioner, mm-hmm. I don't know him, so it's not as if I'm patting the back of a friend, I thought was very progressive in his views in working with the FDA on behalf of patients who are suffering from diseases for whom there are no treatments. And he has been very progressive in trying to speed the process of taking these compounds. Obviously, you have to run clinical trials, but you may have a disease where all the markers of the disease are being benefited by the drug, but you haven't proven yet that it cured or halted the progression of that drug. And I'm thinking of muscular dystrophy as a specific example. And he's had the FDA look at these things and say, look, we know it's safe. We've got really good safety data. Early indications are that the compound may be working, but there's no guarantee. But these patients are in desperate need. We're going to give a provisional approval for this drug, keeping in mind that we want the drug sponsor to maintain their studies and follow things closely and continue to report back to us on the ongoing clinical trials. But we'll allow patients in this situation to have access to this drug. Now, keep in mind, there's some hurdles they put there. This has to be something where there's no other treatments. People are failing and they're in desperate situation. That would be the case for a drug, again, for lowering bad cholesterol, because there are plenty of things out there and the FDA would want a full account. So I think that's a very progressive way of doing this. I think what will happen is some of these drugs will pan out and be life-saving or life-changing for patients who had no other choices, and others won't, and they'll end up being discontinued. But I think that's a risk-benefit that a lot of these patients are more than and have been vocal about being willing to take. Now, I will say that, however, and I'm a biopharma guy, there have been moves by certain opinion leaders that have said, well, the FDA should just be measuring drugs based on safety, and then let's see what happens in the clinic. And I think that would be a disaster. I'll give you a great potential example, and that was in the Alzheimer's area. Eli Lilly had, and Merck did for that matter as well, had very interesting drugs that act by a defined mechanism that were believed to have the potential to reverse plaque in the brains of Alzheimer's patients. And it's the plaque in one's brains that's believed to cause all of the symptoms and deterioration of the brain. And in fact, they went into patients and early studies show that they were actually lowering the protein that produce these plaques in the brain. In a scenario I just described, where you'd be a little more lax, the FDA could have given them conditional approval, and I can tell you that millions of people would have got, anybody with Alzheimer's or family history of Alzheimer's would have tried to take this drug. And then when they ran the multi-year, very expensive, long studies, these drugs didn't work. And why didn't they work? Well, nobody seemed to know. They first looked at patients with severe disease that worked there. They went to moderate disease, et cetera, but it just failed. Mm-hmm. So I think you have to really think through various drugs that for people in need, and make sure that you're not exposing too many people to something that really won't work. And so I think each case, you go by a case-by-case situation. Finally, now the last peel of the onion that you gave me on what Merck did in Southeast Asia. It's interesting. I wasn't aware of that. So you taught me a little bit on that one. It's interesting that they've gone to China, and China's agreed to this. It's not as if you're taking a drug that's unproven. Keytruda is a marvelous drug. If listeners are not aware of it, it upregulates one's immune system to help fight cancer. But it doesn't work in everyone. It doesn't work in certain type of cancers, and this trying to learn why. But certainly, it's a drug with a track record of success. The fact that the China government was willing to take the road and says, look, we're willing to take people who fail, I'm assuming who failed other conventional therapies, and have them take Keytruda is, I guess, somewhat enlightened and unusual, and I hope it can pan out. Certainly, Merck will be able to study many patients, and you have to remember also that the genetic makeup of Chinese is different from Westerners and other genetically diverse people, and so you may get a different profile in Chinese patients than you might in Western patients in similar cancers to Keytruda. So it's a tremendous opportunity to learn a lot about a drug, proven drug, where the safety profile is very well known, and learn from it. So it'll be interesting to see how that works out.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. It'd be very interesting. I promise you only one more multi-part question, and then
that's okay.
We'll get into the wrap up. Going back to something that we touched on earlier, when you brought up the sort of the transition from small molecules to more complex biologics, gene therapy, cell therapies, things of this nature. One thing in recent years we've seen more of is what I refer to as untraditional pharmaceutical entities, or weird products that some companies are beginning to develop. I talk about, for instance, I was employed many years ago by GSK, and a couple of years ago they put about $750 million into something called electroceuticals, hoping at some point, I guess, to get the drug out of the equation and use electricity and other signals, biophysical signals or what have you, as the drug itself. And then I also think about some of the sort of the microbiome stuff that's going on, where the drug is, I think PureTech might be invested in some stuff, but a cocktail of bacteria or microorganisms, or basically the drug looks very different than the little pill, the Norvasc or whatever I take from my local CVS looks today. It is a two-part question. Number one, based on your experience with regulators, are they getting better at reviewing and approving this type of stuff that they don't usually have experience with, or is there is there still a long time frame that exists between when the FDA, for instance, writes up a guidance on how something should be done, and then how they ultimately approve these things? And number two, second part of the question, before we talk about metformin, and you brought up the fact that after 70 plus years, people still don't really know about mechanism of action. But thinking back to my big pharma days, everyone was always so concerned about mechanism of action. But some of this new stuff, it's going to be hard to say how an electrical shock or how a little group of bacteria, what the mechanism of action of this stuff is. Is this a problem? Is it not? Are we moving away from mechanism of action and moving more to mode being as important? Sorry, that was a long-winded question, but I really would love to hear your thoughts on these.
Sure. And I'm getting used to your long-winded questions, so this is working out very well. First of all, before answering, I want to give the audience complete transparency. At PureTech, we go into very nascent ideas, and then we start companies if there's something we think behind the ideas. And so I'm going to answer part of your question using two PureTech examples. One of the companies we formed is called Achille. It's based on technology that came out of the University of California at San Francisco, Professor Adam Gazzilli's lab. And it's the use of video games to help cognition disorders. And, you know, it's not like playing Warcraft or whatever the latest games are, but rather it's based on some sound neuroscience principles, trying to focus on one task while other tasks are coming into play. And the Gazzilli lab did marvelous work in looking at improving brain plasticity, for lack of a better term. Well, we got involved with Achille in this whole technology, and this is not a pill, obviously. It's a video game, but it's something that we actually went to the FDA and said, we think this has a role in helping with attention deficit disorder, ADHD. And the FDA said, fine, we want you to run a clinical trial looking at these parameters, which we've done. And not we, it's the royal we, Achille has done. And in fact, we got very exciting results that show that the effect we're getting on standardized standardized measurements that the FDA has helped establish for ADHD, we're getting as good an effect as you would get with the medications that are out there. So, that's pretty exciting, I think, because it offers an alternative to people who don't necessarily want to take a drug with the attendant side effects that they have. And I'm a drug guy, so I'm not bad-mouthing the industry, but I think if your 6-year-old comes home from school and the teacher says he has ADHD, and you're given the choice between a pill and a video game, you might pick the video game.
Sure.
So, in answer to your question on how the FDA is handling these things, they seem very open to new therapies, newer ways of approaching disease. Their key is always safety. Safety first, and then efficacy that's real efficacy, particularly in areas where they're very familiar. You mentioned the microbiome. Again, we started, I think, one of the leading microbiome companies called Vedanta. And here we are looking at, we have, again, started a great partnership with researchers in Tokyo, and found that people with various disorders, let's say inflammatory bowel disease, are missing certain bacteria in their microbiome. And we have found in animal models, and are now running clinical studies to prove it, that if you can replenish these bacteria, you restore the gut to health. Well, that's pretty exciting. Now, again, this is early days. The FDA, while approving clinical trials in this area, and has said the kind of things they would like to see in an approval package, hasn't gone through the process yet. But we're confident that, again, if we show it's safe and we show it's effective, that they're not going to say, well, this is different, we don't know what to do. They will treat it like any other potential therapy along the way. So I think the agency is learning. The industry is learning, doctors are learning, and hopefully we'll all get to a point where we can benefit people in new ways.
Wonderful. And I look forward to my son. Well, he's ADHD, but he plays a lot of video games. So
there you go.
I think there's something therapeutic at some point. So finally, the wrap-up question. It has nothing to do with pharmaceuticals or science, anything like that. It's what we call the science-fixing question. I'm giving you, Dr. John LaMattina, a chance to travel in my time machine anywhere to talk to any historical person you would like to, Jonas Salk, Einstein, Edison. You can go into the future if you want and talk to your great-great-great-grandchildren. Take a couple minutes with this one if you need to, but where do you, Dr. LaMattina, want to travel, and what do you want to talk about with that person when you meet them?
Oh, boy. This would probably be not an answer you're expecting. I would like to see a few things. I would like to see, one, somebody figured out a way to treat Alzheimer's disease. I think I'm not worried about cancer treatments. Cancer is a horrible disease, but so much is out there now. So much is coming on board within 10 years, maybe. It's already happening now. Within a decade, I think any cancer that's diagnosed and not able to be treated surgically will be treated with a cocktail of drugs, something to upregulate your immune system, something specific for that type of tumor that's driving that tumor, and that sort of stuff is already happening. So I think that's a reality, and I don't think that's science fiction. But Alzheimer's, boy, I don't know. And as the baby boomer generation gets older, we're going to have more and more examples of this. It's going to drive healthcare costs dramatically. It's going to be a real problem that we're all going to have to face up to. And the fact that we're doing other things, for example, like making cancer a chronic disease and heart disease better, and hopefully people stop smoking and we get around that. The outcome of all this is going to be more and more people with Alzheimer's disease. It's just the fact it's a disease of aging, and you didn't see it as much 20 years ago because people didn't live as long as they're living now. So that's a real problem, and that's something I worry about. Boy, if I can go in the future and find out that we've reversed these obesity trends, that would be wonderful.
That would be a nice one.
It's so scary, and I would encourage your listeners to go on the CDC website, cdc.gov, and look at the patterns. They have these wonderful maps that show the fattening of America state by state. They're just a map of the United States, color-coded, and you see how each state on a yearly basis, more and more people are increasingly getting obese to the point where there are states in this country where close to 40% of the population is defined as being obese. I think that's a BMI of over 30. And with all the attendant diseases that come with that. In fact, they also have maps to show that there's a 5-year lag time, but the type 2 diabetes also increases in those same, across the country, but particularly in those states where obesity has increased. The tie-in is unbelievable. And type 2 diabetes leads to heart attacks and strokes, and leads to blindness and kidney disease and amputations. That this is going to become, hopefully I'll come back and I'll be amazed by all this. You're too young probably to remember this. There was a Woody Allen movie some years ago.
Yeah, Sleeper. I was just thinking of it as you're talking.
Exactly right. And he goes back to life, and in his old life, he was running a health food store, and he goes back and finds that so all science was disproven, and it turns out hot fudge sundaes really are the most nutritious.
And cigarettes are good.
So I'm not sure I want to come back necessarily to that, but I would like to come back and see that my great-grandchildren really, all these things were a thing of the past, and Alzheimer's was treatable, and cancer was treatable, and people were living healthy lives till into their early hundreds, and 110 was, you can have a rich and valuable life much longer. So that would be my science fiction.
Wonderful. I appreciate that very much, and I'm in the same basket as you. If we can make this better for my kids and their kids, I'll be happy. And that's one of the reasons that I hang around in this stressful industry for so long. John, it's really been an honor having you here. Really, thanks so much. Once again, for everybody listening, Dr. John LaMattina, former president of Pfizer Global R&D, venture partner at PureTech Ventures. You can go buy his books on Amazon, Drug Truths, Dispelling the Myths of R&D, and Devalued and Distrusted, Can the Pharmaceutical Industry Restore Its Broken Image? Read his column in Forbes magazine, just a major font of knowledge for this industry, and where it's been, where it's going. And it's just, thank you so much again for joining today. And
my pleasure. Ira, it's been a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.